Well, on Saturday, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese outlined the question the government once asked of Australians at a referendum about an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament. It's prompted furious debate about the merits of the proposal ahead of a referendum during this term of Parliament. Joining me to discuss this is Sky News host Chris Kenny, who was also a member of the Australian Government's Senior Advisory Group on the Voice. Chris, thanks for your time. Within a few minutes of Anthony Albanese making that speech at the Garma Festival on Saturday, we had Lidia Thorpe come out and criticise the plan. Now we've got Pauline Hanson saying she's going to spearhead the No campaign. We've heard Noel Pearson talk about the radical centre when it comes to this debate. That radical centre is going to have to be pretty strong, is it not, if it's going to win this debate?
It sure is, Matt. Good to talk to you. Yeah, it's a strange marriage, isn't it, when you've got Lidia Thorpe and Pauline Hanson combined in opposition to this project. Look, this is a pretty important initiative in my view. It's been many decades in the making and the debate's going to be pretty difficult. But the extremes on either end, of course, are going to be the enemy of the good here. You're always going to have some extremists who don't want to do anything when it comes to Indigenous reconciliation in this country, or the people like Lidia Thorpe who just want to divide the nation and put forward very radical proposals. I think most Australians are in the mainstream, are in the middle. They want reconciliation. They want to do it in a practical way. And I think the debate has only really just begun with this, now that Anthony Albanese has put the recommended changes to the Constitution out there, and we need to see more detail on exactly what sort of a voice Labor will legislate. It's only now people are starting to talk seriously about what the issues are, what the possible benefits are, and what Indigenous people want. And importantly, I think, Matt, what this does for the whole country, because this is not a reform just to help Indigenous people. This is a reform to try and improve the nation, to make us a better nation, to deliver reconciliation. So there's a long way to go, and I think the extremes of the debate need to be ignored to a large degree. We've got to concentrate on the mainstream where there are legitimate questions to be asked and a decent debate to be had.
I suppose one of the questions that is being asked, and it's a question certainly being asked here in the Northern Territory and by our Senator Jacinta Price, is how an Indigenous voice to Parliament might help some of those issues that we really are confronted by every day here in the Northern Territory. I talk about domestic violence and some of those alcohol abuse issues that really are front and centre here. Is this something that a voice can help address?
I think it has to, Matt. I don't think it's worth doing unless it can deliver some practical benefits. And the idea is that if you get decent grassroots Indigenous input into decision making, you'll find out what the real problems are and you'll get some ideas and feedback on what the solutions are. We know, of course, as you talk about these problems, we know whatever we've been doing so far hasn't worked. And we do know, of course, that governments, especially the federal government, have specific powers where they're allowed to make laws specifically on Indigenous issues. So it's only fair and only sensible that Indigenous people should have an input into that process. So, yeah, I think as long as the voice is grassroots, which is the work we've done so far, make sure that's the case. You make sure you have local groups, regional groups, grassroots people feeding in their ideas and their feedback, well, then it can only help to address those problems. If it doesn't help to address practical problems, then it would be an absolute failure. And if you knew it wasn't going to address those practical problems, you wouldn't bother with it. I think that's the challenge, and that's where I would put a call out to my good friend Jacinta Price and others who are sceptical about a voice. I would say don't dismiss it. Don't dismiss it as symbolic or not important, but don't compare it or contrast it or put it into competition with those practical outcomes. Get involved and shape it and make sure it does help deliver those practical outcomes.
One thing I think we notice a lot from up here in the Northern Territory, Chris, when we see a discussion about Aboriginal affairs, is that the discussion that happens on a national level seems to be a world away from the issues that we're dealing with here, and even the views that people have here, often the views that Aboriginal people have. To give you one example, whenever I see a discussion about the fracking debate in the Northern Territory, it seems to be accompanied by a story, saying that traditional owners are opposed to the onshore gas industry. And yet, if you read the latest edition of the National Indigenous Times, you'll see a big story with traditional owners who support the onshore gas industry because of the economic benefits they can see from that. And in fact, they needed the majority of support of those traditional owners to get that industry and get that up and running in the first place. Is there a way that the Voice can harness some of those voices that we don't often hear in national debates and get them a bit more prominence on a national stage?
Yeah, Matt, I think that's such an important point. I mean, that gets back to the same point of making sure that it's grassroots, making sure that there's local input, making sure you're giving voice to people who have been excluded from the debate, from the decision-making process in the past. And I think that's crucial, and that gets down to how you design all of those local groups. But this is where, again, I come back to someone who's so important in this debate, like Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, who's going to be on my program tonight. She talks about how we've had the Indigenous elite, if you like, those well-known Aboriginal leaders from the cities who have been prominent in the national debate for the last many decades who promote an Indigenous voice. And she's right to say you don't want those people becoming the Indigenous voice, but that's not what they're proposing, and that's not what should be delivered. You've got to make sure you get those grassroots voice, different voices, different points of views, so you can actually have some of these issues thrashed out. Because, as you know, apart from improving education outcomes, improving health, addressing some of those issues around domestic violence and drug abuse, the number one issue for most Indigenous communities, whether they're remote communities or those many communities attached to regional centres, is jobs and economic opportunities. And that can be tied into development on native title land or Aboriginal held land. So you've got to make sure that we develop economic opportunities, and from that so much else flows when it comes to all the education, health and wellbeing outcomes. So, I think you're right. It's just got to happen this way. It's not worth doing the Voice if it becomes the same old voices and the same old process. The whole idea is to make sure you get to the grassroots of different Indigenous communities right across the country. And as you know, from those heavily populated suburban centres where there are big Indigenous populations, to the remote communities, and probably more importantly to the so many regional towns and areas where there are big Indigenous populations. And there's all sorts of problems and all sorts of opportunities. You've got to hear from everybody and just feed into government, trying to get some practical decisions made. Because, I mean, as a country, we all want the same thing here. Everybody wants the gap between Indigenous life expectancy, employment outcomes and lifestyles closed. It's just a matter of the best way to do it. And I think a Voice is very much a significant and useful step forward. And that's why I'm glad this debate's finally begun.
Well, looking forward to your debate with Jacinta Price on your program coming up at 5 o'clock too. Chris Kenny, thanks for joining us today.
Cheers, Matt. Go well.